Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Tuesday Night's Anatomy with Daniel Okwan. Now, today's tutorial is going to be a quick revision on the human heart that we've already discussed. So please, if you've not watched that video already, please do so that you can get comprehensive understanding regarding the subject matter. Yes, I'm going to do this revision through some questions. I'll help you get the correct answers, to justify why they are correct actually. Then of course, those ones which are not correct, we try and explain, give reasons why they are not correct. So without much ado, let's begin our journey looking at this revision questions I have for you. So I begin with question number 1, and question number 1 says, which of the following is not true? Now option A says the sinoatrial node, that's the pacemaker, can conveniently be referred to as the heart of heart. Yes, I mean the SA node, which is also known as the sinoatrial node, or otherwise the pacemaker of the heart. Yes, we know that the heart, I've already told you that it is myogenic, able to beat on its own, rhythmically, throughout life without even external nervous stimulation. So it tells you that there should be something which should trigger this contraction of the heart. Without it, the heart becomes functionless, and therefore that thing which helps the heart to function, initiated contractile activity, can be referred to as the heart of heart. Therefore, the sinoatrial node, you can conveniently refer to it as the heart of heart. Now, option B says the Purkinje fibers, supply the walls of the ventricles. Yes, this is a very true statement. Yes, we know that from the SA node, the sinoatrial node, it will go through the AV node, that's the atrioventricular node. Then of course from there, it will divide into what we call the atrioventricular bundle of His. Then from there we get to the right and left bundles of His. Then of course from there it will divide into these smaller branches, which we call them the Purkinje fibers, and these Purkinje fibers are going to be very important in supplying the walls of the ventricle, so that it can help in contraction of the heart. Now option C says the left ventricle is endowed with the thickest wall. This is a very true statement. Yes, we know that the atria are going to pump blood, but for their pumping of blood, they are just pumping it to just the ventricles, because the left ventricles are actually below them, which are just part of the heart itself. Then it means that they don't really work so hard in pumping that blood there, and at the end of the day they are doing it in favor of gravity. So the gravity actually also helps them in pumping that blood to the ventricles. So they are not less thick walled compared to the ventricles. But even with the ventricles, the right atrium, is actually pumping the blood to the outside the heart, but it's actually getting to what we call the lungs. Okay, but considering actually the left ventricle is pumping the blood to all parts of the body except the lungs. So it tells you that pressure of the blood should be great enough to supply every part of the body, and that is why the left ventricle is going to be endowed with the thickest wall, and we will look at that one. Now option D says atrial diastole ensures that blood enters the heart. This is a very true statement. You know that for instance, if you take the right atrium, what happens is that both the superior and inferior vena cava, as well as even the coronary sinus, will open into the right atrium of the heart. Okay, will supply the heart with oxygen poor blood. Okay, now for one thing that is very important is that the right atrium will have to relax to receive the blood, and it will pump it to get into the right ventricle. In the same vein, the left atrium, will relax to receive that blood which will be coming, and this blood will be oxygen-rich blood, which will be actually coming from what we call the lungs through what we call the pulmonary veins. Okay, so the left atrium will have to also, relax to receive the blood. The relaxation of the blood to ensuring that blood, either oxygen-rich blood or oxygen-poor blood, enters the heart. What will happen is what we call atrial diastole. So atrial diastole, will ensure that blood enters the heart. Okay, that's very important. Then of course, option E says the opening of the right atrium into the right ventricle is guarded by the mitral valve. This is actually a wrong statement. Because it is supposed to be the tricuspid valve, because the right atrium and the right ventricle are separated by what you call the tricuspid valve. And of course, the left atrium and the left ventricle are separated by what we call the bicuspid valve. And that bicuspid valve is also known as the mitral valve. Okay, but look at what it says now. It says or the right atrioventricular valve. This right atrioventricular valve, yes, it's true that one is going to separate the right atrium from the right ventricle because that's the same as the tricuspid valve, but it is not synonymous to mitral valve. So you have to be very vigilant when it comes to some of these questions. So with question number 1, which of the following is not true? Yes, the answer is before you is option E. Now, so let's actually go through this. Now, we are in the right atrium of the heart. In the right atrium of the heart, actually in the posterior aspect, a lot of activities are taking place there. But over here, now you can see there's the superior vena cava. Yes, underside of the superior vena cava, actually in what we call the superolateral aspect of the right atrium, we are having this node over here. And this node is known as the sinoatrial node, the SA node. Okay, and that's the pacemaker, okay, setting the pace for contraction of the heart. So that's, electrical activity, yes, will have to be spread to what we call the AV node, atrioventricular node, which of course is located in the triangle of Koch over here. That's where you find it. And then of course it goes into this area, this septa, to give rise to what we call the atrioventricular bundle of His. Then this atrioventricular bundle of His, yes, in the interventricular septum, yes, actually divides into what we call the right and of course the left bundles of His, okay, which of course will divide into smaller branches, which we call them the Purkinje fibers, to supply actually the ventricular wall. So it is not surprising that the ventricular wall, yes, the electrical activity, yes, will be spread all the way from the SA node to AV node to AV atrioventricular bundle of His to right and left bundles to reach of course these Purkinje fibers to supply these kind of muscles of what we call the ventricles. Okay, so that's what we are going to see. So I've told you that, yes, because this is the SA node which is going to initiate contraction of the heart, we can conveniently refer to it as the heart of hearts. Yes, let's go through this one too. Now if I take a section through the heart, okay, revealing the walls of what we call the left ventricle as well as the right ventricle, because I can see the apex over here, then I know this is actually the left ventricle. Now you can see that the left ventricle is quite thick walled compared to that of the right ventricle. In fact, it is at least 3 times thicker compared to that of the right ventricle. Okay, so that's what we are going to actually see here. And the reason is simple. The reason is that, yes, actually the right ventricle is pumping blood although it's going outside the body. Therefore, yes, the pressure will be great compared to that of the atria. What happens is that it's not going to quite long distances. It's just going to actually that of the lungs only. Okay, but that of the left ventricle is pumping that blood. It should be under much powerful pressure so that it sends that blood to all parts of the body, because you know that the aorta, we are going to even find some in the abdomen, okay, bifurcating into the iliacs, okay, to supply of course the lower limbs, pelvic area, everywhere, and therefore it has to be under much powerful pressure. And that is why, of course, yes, because the ventricles are pumping blood against gravity, it should be thick walled, but that of the left ventricle is doing it under much powerful pressure so that I can distribute this oxygen rich blood to all parts of the body except the lungs. Now again, I've told you that, yes, for instance, if you take, there's the right atrium, there's the right ventricle, the right atrium, yes, from the inferior vena cava, from superior vena cava, even from the coronary sinus, yes, oxygen poor blood will get here. Yes, oxygen rich blood will enter the heart again through these pulmonary veins, okay, into what we call the left atrium. So for them to receive that blood, then they will have to go through what we call the relaxation state, and that's what we call atrial diastole. You have to relax to receive something, okay, that's the principle. But of course, they will eject it into what we call the ventricles via what we call atrial systole. But remember that atrial diastole, both right and left atria, will contract and relax at the same time. So atrial diastole, relaxation will happen at the same time. Atrial systole, okay, will happen at the same time. So there's that kind of unison in their contraction and relaxation. Similarly, for the ventricles, yes, they also have to relax to receive the blood. So they will go to what we call ventricular diastole, and then they will contract, okay, to eject the blood into either, of course, the pulmonary trunk if it's through the right ventricle, or into the aorta if it's through the left ventricle. okay, and that's what we call ventricular systole. So ventricular systole will ensure that blood actually leaves the heart, unlike atrial diastole, ensuring that blood enters the heart. So that's what we are going to see. So let's go to question number 2. Now question number 2 says, which of the following is not true? Now option A says the heart is a content of the middle mediastinum. Yeah, this is a very true statement. I already told you that yes, with the help of the transverse thoracic plane, we are able to divide the midway of the thoracic cavity, yes, taking out where the lungs are, then we are going to have the mediastinum. So with the help of the transverse thoracic plane, we are able to divide this mediastinum into a superior mediastinum, which is going to be found above this transverse thoracic plane, but it will be limited by what we call the superior thoracic aperture. Then of course we're going to have the inferior mediastinum, which is actually divided into anterior, middle and posterior with the help of course the pericardium. So I will show you that one. Okay, so that's a very true statement. The heart, together with the root of its great vessels, even together with the the pericardium itself, will be content of this what we call middle mediastinum. Now option B says the visceral pericardium is intimately associated with the heart and forms part of the epicardium. Yes, this is a very true statement. I've told you that if you look at the serous pericardium, apart from the fibrous pericardium, the serous pericardium proper, yes, is going to have what we call the visceral component, which will be intimately associated with the heart, because the word visceral has to do with organ. So the organ here is the heart, and therefore will be surrounded by this visceral pericardium. Okay, and we know that this visceral pericardium, together with the epicardial fat, will contribute to the formation of this epicardium. Now option C says atrioventricular sulcus, otherwise known as coronary sulcus, serves as the internal landmark separating the atria, okay, and ventricles. Okay, so they will separate the atria from the ventricles. This is a false statement, because what happens is that yes, atrioventricular sulcus is the same as coronary sulcus. That's very true, but it doesn't serve as the internal landmark. Rather, it serves as the external landmark, okay, to separate the atria from the ventricles. I'll show you. Remember that the internal landmarks will be the valves, by way of the bicuspid valve separating the left atrium from the left ventricle, and then the tricuspid valve separating of course the right atrium from the right ventricle. So option C is actually the wrong statement. Now option D says in severe mitral valve incompetence, there is regurgitation of blood from the left ventricle into the left atrium of the heart. Yes, if the mitral valve, which is supposed to separate the left atrium from the left ventricle, is incompetent, then it will be manifested by what we call regurgitation. Now we know that valves are supposed to ensure unidirectional flow of blood, ensuring that there's one-way flow of blood. Okay, so it means that blood should flow from the right ventricle, left atrium into the left ventricle without coming back. But if the valve is not working properly, then it will be manifested as regurgitation, so that blood, this oxygen-rich blood in the left, which has passed from moved from what we call the left atrium into the left ventricle, will move back, okay, from the left ventricle. Some will move back into what we call the left atrium, and that's what is manifested in severe mitral valve incompetence. So when that happens, it means that less oxygen-rich blood will be pumped to the aorta to be distributed to all parts of the body. So it means that there's that likelihood of what we call hypoxia to the body cells. Now option E says the pulmonary trunk contains blood with high partial pressure of oxygen, with low partial pressure of oxygen than that of pulmonary veins. Yes, it's very true. I've told you that post-fetal life, yes, normally we expect that arteries should carry oxygen-rich blood, veins should carry oxygen-poor blood. But it's exactly opposite with respect to the pulmonary vessels. So that the pulmonary trunk, we know it's an artery supposed to carry oxygenated blood, but this time around it's going to carry deoxygenated blood, and therefore the blood that it will carry, will contain low partial pressure of oxygen. The oxygen in there will be low compared to that of the pulmonary veins, because the pulmonary veins will be supplying the left atrium with oxygen-rich blood, and therefore the partial pressure of oxygen in there will be very high. So by way of justifying what we are saying, yes, I've told you that yes, apart from the lungs, investing what we call the pleura, the midway of the thoracic cavity is what we call the mediastinum. so that the mediastinum, with the help of course the transverse thoracic plane, this plane, okay, this imaginary line that we draw actually from the sternal angle of Louis to what we call the T4 T5 vertebral level, okay, we are able to divide this midway, okay, this mid portion of what we call the thoracic cavity into what we call the superior aspect, and therefore we call this one the superior mediastinum, okay, with that limits coming from what we call the superior thoracic aperture or the thoracic inlet, okay. And then of course, then below this transverse thoracic plane we are going to have the inferior mediastinum with its limits actually ending at the superior aspect of what we call the diaphragm, okay. But you realize that with the help of what we call the pericardium, then we are able to divide the inferior mediastinum into three parts: anterior part, yes, of course, middle part, and of course posterior part. Remember, I've done this video on the mediastinum, so you can watch this video to get more understanding, in this regard. So that of course in the middle mediastinum, yes, apart from the heart together with the pericardium, you have the root of its great vessel. Then of course, the arch of aorta together with the main branches, yes, the brachiocephalic trunk, yes, talking about the left subclavian, talking about the left common carotid, yes, they are going to be content of course the superior mediastinum. Of course, talk about talk about the esophagus, okay. The superior portion of the thoracic esophagus, yes, will be part of the part there. Of course, talk about the trachea, yes, will also be there, okay. So these are some of those things. Talk about even of course the main tributaries to what we call the superior vena cava. Talk about the brachiocephalic veins, yes, they will also be there, okay. So that's what we are actually going to see. Talk about the posterior mediastinum, we are going to have the descending thoracic aorta. Talk about the esophagus, yes, they will all be there, okay. So of course, even talking about the the thoracic duct, yes, will also be there because it's a sense here, and it even becomes a content, an organ that you find in the transverse thoracic plane, okay. So that's what we are going to see. Talking about the anterior mediastinum, we are going to have the thymus together with the thymic fat, even the superior portion, okay, coming over the way here, superior part of it, we are going to have the thymus as well as even the anterior mediastinum together with of course the thymic fat. So that is what the mediastinum is. So the heart is actually a content of the middle mediastinum. Yes, I've told you that the heart will be surrounded by what we call the pericardium, because the heart actually invests it. The word peri has to do with around, so it surrounds it. Now remember that this pericardium, apart from the fibrous pericardium, okay, which is a fibrous tissue, we are going to have what you call the serous pericardium. The serous pericardium, that portion, assuming this is the serous pericardium is actually double layered membrane, just like this balloon, so that the heart, where is the viscera, actually invests into it, pushes through one side of it. So as it pushes through that side of it, that membrane which covers the heart over here is going to be the visceral pericardium. So assuming this faces the heart, this is the visceral pericardium, and this part where is actually going to line the wall, where is not intimately associated with the viscera, where is the heart, is going to be the parietal pericardium. So that there's this potential space which is filled with pericardial fluid, being the pericardial cavity. Okay, so that's what we are going to see. So I want you to know that this part which is intimately associated with the heart is known as the visceral pericardium, and this visceral pericardium forms part of the epicardium, okay. Now I told you about coronal sulcus, okay, that is what we call the atrioventricular sulcus. We have the atria, we have the ventricles, externally they will be separated by what we call the atrioventricular sulcus, and that is also known as the coronal sulcus, because of course the coronary vessels, okay, actually run through the sulcus, okay. So that's what we see. Yes, remember I told you that internally the separation between atria and ventricles will be by what we call the valves, okay, bicuspid valves, tricuspid valves. But what happens is that externally the ventricles are separated by what we call the interventricular sulcus. We have an anterior part and we have the posterior part. I'll show you, okay, when we get to another question I'll show you something about it, okay. So that's what we are going to see. But internally, yes, will be separated by what we call the interventricular septum, okay. That's what we see. Now talk about the mitral valve, assuming this is actually the left atrium and this is the left ventricle, we expect that the blood, okay, the oxygen-rich blood coming from the lungs through this pulmonary, veins, reaching the left atrium of the heart, will be, pumped into what we call the left ventricle. Okay, so that yes, because of this valve being the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve, there shouldn't be regurgitation, there shouldn't be backflow of the blood in here. It should go into what we call the aorta only. But if this valve is working in an incompetent manner, then what will happen is that yes, it may get prolapse, and then of course there will be regurgitation of blood into what we call the left atrium once again. So it means that the blood that will be pumped, the oxygen-rich blood that will be pumped from the left ventricle into the aorta will not be enough. Okay, and therefore I told you that yes, most likely it may lead to what we call hypoxia in the tissues of the body. Okay, so that's what we are going to see. However, we also have what we call mitral valve stenosis. Say that this mitral valve becomes narrow, so that less blood, it will harden, occluding. What will happen? The blood that may go through it. So it means that minimal blood will move from the what we call the left atrium into the left ventricle. Therefore, less oxygen-rich blood will be pumped to the aorta to be distributed to all parts of the body except the lungs. So it tells you that again, mitral valve stenosis will present with similar effects systemically to that of the mitral valve incompetence or regurgitation. So that what will happen is that yes, there will be tissue hypoxia. Okay, there will be tissue hypoxia. Okay, so it has to be corrected surgically. So that's one thing that you have to know. Okay, yes, I told you about the partial pressure of oxygen in the pulmonary trunk being low. Yes, this because you can see that over here the color is somewhat blue, so it means that the blood that is conveyed through the pulmonary trunk and therefore going into the left and right pulmonary arteries and into the lungs is having low partial pressure of oxygen compared to that blood which will be coming from the lungs through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium. So we can see that this one is reddish, or it's red in color. So it tells you that the blood that is coming is having high partial pressure of oxygen. That's what I want to show you. Let's go to question number 3, and question number 3 says, which of the following is false? Option A says the valve of the coronary sinus is also called called with the eponym Eustachian valve. Now there's a wrong statement. Yes, the valve of the coronary sinus is actually Thebesian valve. I'll show you. This Eustachian valve is the valve of the inferior vena cava, so you have to know. So it means that we already know our answer. The answer is A. But let's go through the other options and see. Option B says the inferior border of the heart is formed largely by the right atrium. This is a very true statement. Yes, of course, we know that the inferior border of the heart is formed largely by the right ventricle, with some contribution coming from the left ventricle actually. So this is a true statement. Now option C says the ear-like appendages of the heart are referred to as the auricles. Yes, we know we have the right and left auricles. Okay, they are the ear-like appendages. Okay, structures that we find associated with actually the right and left atria of the heart. Now option D says the pulmonary semilunar valve is auscultated at the second left intercostal space. Yes, this is a very true statement. That's the pulmonary valve. The pulmonary valve is actually auscultated at the second left, yes, of course, intercostal space. The second right intercostal space, yes, is going to be actually the aortic valve, aortic semilunar valve. Yes, option E says the internal structural compartment, okay, of sulcus terminalis, okay, being the crista terminalis, divide the internal aspect of the right atrium into smooth anterior part and rough posterior part. Yeah, this is also a wrong statement. So with this question, we are going to have two wrong statements. These two wrong statements are A and E. Okay, A and E. The reason is that yes, the internal structural compartment of what we call the sulcus terminalis. Now externally we have sulcus terminalis, but internally of the right atrium we are going to have what we call cresta terminalis. That's the terminal crest, and that one divides the internal aspect of the right atrium into a smooth, actually posterior part. The posterior part is actually smooth and the anterior part is rough. I'll show you. So there we are. here we have taken our scalpel blade going through what we call the right atrium. We've cut through the wall so that it reveals the internal aspect for us. Yes, you can see that you have the fossa ovalis over here. I'm not interested in that one, but I'm interested in showing you that here we have the inferior vena cava opening into what we call the posterior aspect, okay, posterior aspect of what we call the right atrium, and it is having this valve. Remember that superior vena cava is devoid of valve because it's draining its oxygen poor blood from the head regions, along or in favor of gravity. But out of inferior vena cava is going against gravity, and therefore will have to be supplied with this valve. Its valve is known as Eustachian valve. But the question was talking about the valve of the coronary sinus, and the valve of the coronary sinus, okay, bringing oxygen poor blood from, of course, the heart myocytes itself. Then it's going to be the Thebacean valve. Okay, Thebacean valve, and that's what I want to show you. Now, of course, talking about the borders of the heart. Yes, the question was talking about the inferior border of the heart. So if you look at the heart, yes, there's the posterior superior aspect of the heart formed by actually the atria together with the auricles, and then of course the anterior inferior aspect of the heart being the ventricles. So once you can see the apex, then it means that here we have the left ventricle, then this is the right ventricle, then of course the atria will be there, which are actually hidden by the roots of these great vessels. So let me just take my time to go through this one with you again. If you look at the right border of the heart, yes, mainly by the right atrium together with its auricle. Yes, of course, if you look at what we call the left border, okay, the left border of the heart, yes, is formed by the ventricle, actually the left ventricle, okay, together with some part of the right ventricle, okay. Sorry, the left border, yes, the left ventricle is forming it, okay, with some part coming from actually the left atrium together with its auricle, okay. And then of course, if you look at the inferior border, which I've explained to you, that is formed mainly by, of course, the right ventricle with some contribution coming from the left ventricle. That's what we are going to see. Then of course the base or the superior border is formed by actually the right and left atria together with actually the roots of the great vessels, okay. That's what we are going to see. Yes, talking about the auricles, yes, these are the auricles. Auricles are actually not part of the chambers of the heart. The chambers of the heart, the superior chambers or the posterior superior chambers of the heart are the atria. So you have the right auricle and you have the left auricle. They are the appendages of the heart, actual appendages of what we call the right and left atria. Yes, talk again about the auscultatory areas. The valves sounds can be listened to, right? And you have to know the surface anatomy very well so that I can actually auscultate these sounds. So that the question, yes, was actually on the pulmonary semilunar valve, and you are going to listen to the pulmonary semilunar valve at what we call just parasternal to the just immediately away from what we call the body of the sternum. We are going to have the second left intercostal space, okay, and you listen to that sound. And then opposite to that, yes, the second right intercostal space, you can listen to what we call the aortic semilunar valve, okay. Then again, below that one, below what we call around the fifth, okay, right fifth intercostal space, then we are going to listen to what we call the tricuspid valve. Then actually at the mid clavicular line, also around the fifth intercostal space, actually the left, sorry, yeah, the left mid intercostal space around the mid clavicular line area, okay, where we have the left fifth intercostal space. Then we are going to listen to what we call the mitral valve sound. Yes, I told you that, yes, if I take my scalpel blade, yes, externally, I will have what we call sulcus terminalis, okay. But if I cut along the sulcus terminalis, then what will happen is that internally, I'm going to have what we call crista terminalis. Now, this crista terminalis is very important, that is dividing, the interior of the right atrium of the heart into what we call smooth posterior part. Because you can see, this is actually the apex of the heart. So it means that you are getting closer to the anterior aspect. I told you that that's where we are going to see the ventricles. Ventricles are not only at the inferior aspect, they are going to be actually anterior-inferior. So it means that over here is the posterior aspect. So this is the smooth posterior part, and this is the rough posterior part. And of course, the smooth posterior part, that's where you're going to have the fossa ovalis. You are going to have these great vessels actually opening, okay, inferior and superior vena cava actually opening in here, as well as the coronary sinus also opening in here. And this rough area is actually marked by what you call the pectinate, pectinate muscles, or the musculi pectinati. So it means that yes, the crista terminalis is dividing the interior part of what we call the atrium, but not into a posterior rough part, but into posterior smooth part and anterior rough part. Let's go to question number 4, and question number 4 says, which of the following is not true? Option A says persistent foramen ovale is a potential precursor to atrial septal defect. Yeah, this is a very true statement. Yes, if there's atrial septal defect, if the septum which is separating the right and left atria is defective, then what will happen is that there could be what we call movement of blood. Actually, from the main problem will be when it is moved from what we call the left atrium into the left ventricle. Okay, so from the left atrium into what we call the right atrium, so that the oxygen rich blood, yes, will be getting into the right atrium. Or even the more problem will come where much of the oxygen poor blood will move from the right atrium, okay, into what we call the left atrium. That's where the main problem is going to come from. So it is actually going to be, if there is still foramen ovale persistent, foramen ovale is supposed to fuse, get close to become what we call fossa ovalis. But if it's still persistent as foramen ovale, then it's going to be a potential precursor to atrial septal defect. Option B says connecting the chordae tendini to the cups of the right and left atrioventricular valves are the papillary muscles. Get to know that this is a wrong statement. The reason is that rather these papillary muscles are connected to what we call the cups of the valves of both right and left atrioventricular valves. Okay, either the bicuspid valve or the tricuspid valve. Okay, they will rather be connected to these valves via what we call chordae tendini and not the other way around. Look at it carefully. It says connecting the chordae tendini to the cups. It's supposed to be connecting the papillary muscles to what we call the cups of the atrioventricular valves, will be actually the chordae tendini. So we can see our wrong answer already is option B. But let's go through C and the rest. Now option C says the internal aspect of the right ventricle is endowed with trabeculae carneae, okay, separated from the smooth part by what we call the supraventricular crest. Yeah, this is a very true statement. You get to know that we have the conus part, or that's the infundibular part, okay, where it's actually the smooth part, which is found above what we call the supraventricular crest, and below that will be the rough part, marked by what we call the trabeculae carneae, okay, trabeculae carneae. Now option number D says the moderator band, otherwise known as the septo-marginal trabecula, is found in the left ventricle of the heart. Okay, it's found in the left ventricle of the heart. This is a wrong statement, because yes, the moderator band, yes, although we call it the septo-marginal trabecula, is found actually in the right ventricle, not the left ventricle. So apart from yes, option B, option D is also wrong. Okay, although let's go through it. Extending from the base of the anterior papillary muscle to the ventricular septum. Yes, this other information is actually true, but the only false thing is that it is not going to be found in the left ventricle. It will be found in the right ventricle, the moderator band. Now option E says the oblique and transverse sinuses are examples of pericardial sinuses. Yes, that's a very true statement. I'm going to show you. So there we are. If there is still persistence of what we call the foramen ovale, it doesn't fuse to become fossa ovalis, then what will happen is that it is going to be a potential source for this atrial septal defect, so that yes, blood can move, oxygen rich blood can move from the left ventricle, okay, into what we call the left atrium into what we call the right ventricle, because of course the left atrium is going to have high pressure. More of the blood most of the time will be moving into what we call the right atrium, and of course into the right ventricle to be pumped into the so that what will happen is that essentially most of the oxygen rich blood was actually supposed to come into the left ventricle, so that it can be pumped to all parts of the body, so that most body cells will be having a lot of oxygen supply. So it means that the oxygen supply to the body cells, yes, except the lungs, will be poor. Okay, and that may lead to what we call hypoxia. So that is what we are going to actually see. Okay, but of course the oxygen poor blood, yes, can also move from here to this side, but mainly because of the high pressure over here to this side, more often it will be coming this way. Okay, so it means that yes, foramen of valley is going to be an important precursor to what we call atrial septal defect. Let's go to this one. Yes, now this one, what I want to show you is that look at this, look at the ventricles. Okay, the ventricles are endowed with what you call papillary muscles. Okay, these are papillary muscles. Now these papillary muscles will be connected to the cups. Okay, these are the cups of the valves, or the atrioventricular valves. Okay, they will be connected by these tendon-like structures, and this is what we call chordae tendineae. It's not the other way around. So papillary muscles are connected to what we call cups of the atrioventricular valves by chordae tendineae. So let's go to this one. Now I told you that yes, in the right ventricle, okay, in the right ventricle, we are going to have what we call the inflow part. The inflow part is actually rough, okay, and the rough nature is due to what we call the trabeculae carneae. Trabeculae carneae. Okay, then we have the smooth part. The smooth part is the conus part, or the infundibular part. Okay, and that is what we call the outflow part. Outflow part. And this smooth part is separated from the rough part, okay, in the right ventricle by this crest, and that's what we call supraventricular crest. Supraventricular crest. Okay. Yes, again, look at the moderator band. Moderator band, you can see there's the apex, okay, of the heart. I told that the apex of the heart is more related, it's related to the left ventricle. So it means that where I've cut is actually the right ventricle. Again, you can still see the supraventricular crest. This is the outflow part, okay, the conus part. This is the rough part, the inflow part, okay, endowed with this kind of rough area, which you call it trabeculae carneae. Now there's a modification of this trabeculae carneae, okay, and that's what we call septum, because it's taking attachment from the septum, okay, into the wall of the ventricle. So we call it septomarginal trabecula. Septomarginal trabecula, and it's actually what we call the moderator band. Moderator band, because it's before you. Yes, moderator band is going to moderate the contractility of the heart, and by so doing it will convey what we call, remember that we said that there will be what we call atrioventricular bundle of His. It will divide into the right and left parts. The right part will be conveyed to give off to eventually divide into what we call the bundle of His, and it will go through what we call this septomarginal trabecula, and that's what we call the moderator band. That is where the right bundle of His will actually be running through. Yes, talking about the sinuses, yes, I've told you that you have oblique sinus, yes, as well as of course the transverse sinus. So let me show you now. Look at this. Transverse sinus is actually going to be found actually behind, okay, what we call the aorta, okay, actually the arch of aorta, because the superior aorta, ascending aorta is not very clear. So actually, yes, the aorta, the ascending of course arch of aorta, as well as of course the pulmonary trunk will be found posterior to it, but it will be found running anterior. So you can see where this arrow is moving. This arrow is running actually behind, okay, where we have this the pulmonary trunk, as well as the ascending aorta, okay, and the arch of aorta, but it's running actually in front of what we call the superior vena cava, and this one is what we call the transverse sinus. Transverse sinus is one of the pericardial sinuses. And then over here, now look at this sinus over here, that's the oblique sinus. Look at it. Now you can see that it's running behind, so you can see that it's going to be found behind what we call the atria, okay, left and right atria, but actually mainly the left atrium. Okay, it's going to be found behind the atria, but it will be running between. Now look at this. This is actually, so this is to the left, because you can see the apex of the heart. So this is the left pulmonary vein. This is left superior pulmonary vein. This is the left inferior pulmonary vein. Then of course this is the right superior, right inferior pulmonary veins. Okay, to be running in between these pulmonary veins, pulmonary veins, and that's what we call the oblique sinus. So they are actually because of the pericardial reflections, okay, that we find, Let's go to question number 5, and this is the last question that I have for you for today, and it says, which of the following is false? Now, option A says the ascending and aortic arch presents with a total of 5 branches under normal conditions. So remember, the ascending aorta will give off the first branch of the aorta, okay, and that's what we call the right and left coronary arteries. And of course, yes, beyond that, yes, the arch of aorta is giving normally 3 branches. It's going to give off, the BCS or the BSC, branches, and the B for brachiocephalic trunk, coronary, left coronary artery, as well as left subclavian artery. Then, of course, option B says the anterior and posterior interventricular sulci, yes, meets the incisura epis cordis, where is a notch located to the right of, the heart apex. Yeah, this is a very true statement. I'll show you. Now, option C says only the right valve is endowed with 3 cups. This is a false statement. Yes, the right atrioventricular valve, that's the tricuspid that the name suggests. Tri means 3, is having 3 cups. It is not the only, valve of the heart which is endowed with 3 cups. Talking about, of course, the pulmonary semilunar valve as well as the aortic semilunar valves. They are also going to be endowed with 3 valves. Okay, I'll show you. Now, option, C, this one is going to have actually just, I think more than 4 options, more than 5 options actually. This one was supposed to be D. So let's see option D again. Now, it says that during ventricular systole, the right ventricle pumps oxygen deficient blood to what we call the pulmonary trunk, with the left ventricle pumping oxygen rich blood to what we call the aorta. Yes, during ventricular systole, okay, they will have to eject the blood out of the heart, and what will happen is that the right ventricle will pump that blood to what we call the pulmonary trunk. That blood is carrying is actually oxygen deficient, oxygen poor, with the left ventricle pumping oxygen rich blood to the aorta. That's a very true statement. Now, option D says the pericardium is essential for infection restraint to the heart. This is a very true statement. I'll show you. We'll give the functions of the pericardium. Yes, option E, where is that supposed to be option F? It says loss of sensation to the fibrous pericardium and the mediastinal pleura is consistent with phrenic nerve injury. Yes, this is a very true statement. I told you that, yes, from the ventral rami of actually C3 to C5, yes, the phrenic nerve emerges in the neck region, but it will go along the way, yes, run along the pericardium to actually supply what we call the, the diaphragm, giving motor supply to the diaphragm. But it also give off some sensory supply to the fibrous pericardium together with the mediastinal aspect of the pleura. Okay, so that's very true. So if the fibrous, pericardium together with the mediastinal pleura are losing sensation, or they are, being irritable, okay, I mean they are not responding to stimuli by way of sensation, then what will happen is that, yes, phrenic nerve injury is most likely. So I want to show you something. Yes, I want to show you that, yes, here is actually the ascending aorta, then it arches around T4 vertebral level to become the arch of aorta. The ascending aorta is going to give off 2 branches, and they are the first branches of the aorta, and they represent what we call the left and of course the right, what we call coronary arteries. I'll go through the coronary circulation with you. Yes, next week you'll get that video on that. Then of course the arch of aorta is given off other 3 branches. Yes, the brachiocephalic trunk, yeah, the left common carotid artery, yeah, the left subclavian artery, okay, in this manner. Yes, now I told you that now over here you can see the apex of the heart. Now look at this. This is what we call the anterior interventricular sulcus. Now in the anterior interventricular sulcus, okay, you can see this. There will be some other vessels over here when we look at the coronary, circulation. Then over here at the posterior aspect, you can see this, the posterior interventricular, sulcus. That one too, blood vessels will be running through it. They are actually external features, okay, that we find on the ventricles, in between the ventricles. But what happens is that, yes, they are actually able to meet, okay, actually right to what we call the right actually at the right side of what we call the right ventricle, and that's notch over there is known as incisura epis cordis. Okay, incisura epis cordis, or you can simply call it the notch of the cardiac apex, because is the apex of the heart. Okay, the apex of the heart. So that the right side, okay, right to what we call the right ventricle, okay, we are going to find what we call the incisura epis cordis. So this incisura epis cordis, yes, is the meeting point of what we call the anterior and posterior interventricular sulci. Okay, anterior interventricular sulci. That's where they extend and meet over here. Yes, I told you that. Yes, although yes, we talk about the valves of the heart. Now look at this cross section over here. Looking at the valves of the heart, the tricuspid valve, as the name suggests, yes, is going to have the septal cups. Okay, it's going to have this anterior cups and then of course posterior cups, making a tricuspid valve. This is the right atrioventricular valve. Then of course you know that for the bicuspid valve we have the anterior cups and of course the posterior cups. Okay, there could be other commissural cups, but these are the main cups that we have, making it bicuspid or the mitral valve. But I'm telling you that it's not only the tricuspid valve or the right atrioventricular valve which is having 3 cups, but in addition we also have these semilunar valves. Although each leaflet or each cups is somewhat half moon shaped, they are going to be tricuspid. For instance, if you take this aortic valve is going to have of course the left and right cups, as well as of course a posterior cups. If you take the pulmonary semilunar valve, yes, that one too, we are going to have of course the right and left cups together with another cups known as the anterior cups. So these semilunar valves are also tricuspid. Yes, talk about ventricular systole. Ventricular systole is going to be very important in sending blood out of the heart. Say that yes, this is for instance, this is the right side, this is the right atrium. Yes, after relaxing to receiving its blood, pumps that blood into the right ventricle. The right ventricle relaxes to receive that blood, pumps it under high pressure into what we call the pulmonary trunk. Similarly, yes, oxygen-rich blood which has reached the left atrium, yes, will be pumped into the what we call the left ventricle, and left ventricle will pump that blood under much powerful pressure into the aorta. Okay, so what I'm trying to tell you is that yes, by way of contraction of these ventricles, that's what we call ventricular systole. Ventricular systole. And ventricular systole, I've told you, yes, that of the right ventricle is taking oxygen poor blood into the pulmonary trunk, eventually into the lungs. That of the left ventricle is pumping that blood, oxygen rich blood, into what we call into the aorta to be distributed to all parts of the body. By way of functions of the pericardium, yes, I've told you that it's going to limit infection spread to the heart, but again, importantly, it's going to help stabilize the heart. For instance, it will anchor the heart into what we call the diaphragm, okay, giving it some kind of support in the thoracic region. Again, yes, even apart from infection, as well as mechanical trauma is concerned, yes, it's going to help in that, especially with the fibrous pericardium. Then, by way of the serous part of the pericardium, what will happen is that fluid will be produced and it will go into what we call the pericardial cavity to lubricate the heart. Okay, especially during its cardiac cycle by way of systole and of course diastole. Then apart from that, it limits excessive stretching of the heart. Okay, excessive stretching, so excessive filling of the heart will be very, very important in helping in that regard. Okay, it limits excessive stretching of the heart when the heart is getting filled with blood. Yes, I told you about the phrenic nerve, yes, coming all the way from the neck region, okay, and actually running along where we have the pericardium. By so doing, giving some sensory supply to what we call the fibrous pericardium, again to what we call, because this is where the lungs will be, and the pleura will be covering the lungs, okay, because the pleura will be invested by the lungs. So the mediastinal aspect of the pleura will also be getting some sensory supply from the diaphragm. I've told you that from the phrenic nerve. I've told you that the phrenic nerve is actually a mixed nerve, okay, having both sensory supply as well as motor supply. That motor supply, yes, is to the diaphragm, So that's what you have to know. So I hope you find this tutorial helpful. Yes, we'll try and complete the heart journey with actually the coronary circulation in our next tutorial. Have a very good time, and may you enjoy this one as we go to other ones. Thank you.